France's capitulation in 1940 was the greatest thrill the Führer could have wished for, and the newsreels show a man almost dancing with joy. To crown his revenge on the French, he ordered the signing of the armistice to take place at Compiègne, where the German capitulation had taken place in 1919. Hitler sat in the same seat as Marshal Foch had done after World War I, and in the same railway carriage. He was satisfying one of his deepest wishes: to revenge and eradicate the humiliation of defeat by France and the shame brought on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. After the signing, Hitler drove through Paris for 3 hours. France was now of no more interest to him. It had fulfilled its part in his drive for power. There was more yet to be done elsewhere. In Berlin, he was greeted as he would have wished, as a conquering hero returning from a famous campaign. A man apart, a man of decisive action, a man of his word who had restored Germany to greatness and who would lead it, surely, to prosperity and uphold its status in the community of nations. Now the Germans felt there would surely be an end to the fighting. There would be no more war. Hitler's boldness made him overconfident, and he decided that following the evacuation at Dunkirk, Britain would either fall to his troops or capitulate beforehand. He preferred the latter scenario, not wanting to lose more troops than necessary against a weakened country that could do no more than offer token resistance. The Luftwaffe was ordered to increase bombing raids on Britain. Hitler allowed himself to be misled by Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, into believing that England could either be brought to the negotiating table or bombed into submission. There was also a more pressing enemy to confront that no one outside of his high command yet knew of: Russia. That was where the greatest amount of Lebensraum was to be found. However, with Churchill as the first uncompromising opponent he had encountered, Hitler was confronted with a problem. So he decided on an invasion of Britain. Operation Sea Lion. This would be completed, he felt, before the winter. Had he learned from this piece of overconfidence, he may not have made the same prediction the following year, before the Wehrmacht invaded Russia. The one condition attached to the invasion of Britain was that the RAF and Royal Navy had to be dealt with first. Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe was equal to the task, but to his intense frustration as the Battle of Britain was fought over southern England and the English Channel, the Luftwaffe seemed unable to sweep the RAF from the skies. Britain was suffering badly, but it was Hitler's anger and arrogance that clouded his thinking and forced him to order ill-judged actions that ruined his chances of occupying Britain. This would not be the last time that the Führer lost sight of his strategic aims and, by believing in his infallibility, became his own worst enemy. A German bomber pilot lost his way over mainland Britain and, chased by an RAF pilot, jettisoned his bomb load over London. There was minimal damage, but Churchill ordered a retaliatory attack on Berlin. Göring had said that no enemy bomber can reach the industrial area of the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, he continued, you may call me Meyer. Hitler was incensed by the Berlin raid and ordered that the Luftwaffe change its tactics to hit British cities. The Blitz had begun, but for all its terror, Hitler's abrupt change of plan saved Britain. The RAF airfields that had been the targets for the German bombers were given a breathing space to recover and rethink tactics. The Luftwaffe, now flying further inland, had to use their fighters as escorts, and the RAF began to turn the new situation to its advantage. Hitler had snatched victory from his Luftwaffe and his 1,000-year Reich through his own anger. As the autumn of 1940 arrived, it seemed increasingly unlikely that the RAF and Royal Navy could be defeated, and uncertain about how to get his men across the Channel unscathed, Hitler wavered. Then, on the 17th of September 1940, with winter weather making seaborne invasion unsuitable, Hitler cancelled the invasion. What could Britain do to harm him, he argued. Britain could be bombed into submission and was of no danger to him now. There was no longer the prospect of fighting on two fronts, a fear that had haunted him after Germany's defeat in World War I. He was impatient to get into Russia and the vital stage of his push for Aryan domination and Lebensraum. He contemptuously ignored the one man who was able to do what he himself had done, inspire and put steel into the resolve of his nation. It was a grave oversight. The pact with Russia produced the positive effects that Hitler had expected. But he was now in a hurry, acutely aware that unless he acted swiftly, the advantage that he possessed, insofar as he was ready for war and Russia was not, would evaporate. Having struck at the Western countries from Norway to France and seen them succumb to the Wehrmacht, in August 1940, General Marx was given the order to prepare the initial invasion plans for one of the largest campaigns in history, the invasion of Soviet Russia. Hitler drew up the final plans for Operation Barbarossa. The phony friendship with Russia had long reverted to bitter public enmity. In the army propaganda periodical Signal, Hitler's regime, ready as always with excuses and blame, set out the justification for the invasion. Those in authority in Moscow, reported the magazine, who had concluded a pact of friendship with National Socialist Germany, were being two-faced. They positioned 160 divisions of the Red Army along their border in order to attack Germany when her back was turned, once the right moment had come. Adolf Hitler ruined these plans. German troops had been sent in secret to the Russian border. Two-thirds of the Wehrmacht had been assembled. No one knew it was happening. Stalin had been warned by Churchill, but thinking that Churchill was trying to split the Russian-German pact, refused to believe the messages. Finally, there were over 3 million Axis troops, including 500,000 Finns and 150,000 Romanians, lined up for the invasion. They were arranged into 3 army groups that would surge into Russia heading north towards Leningrad, into central Russia towards Moscow, and to the south to capture the all-important Russian oil fields of the Caucasus. Although there would now be 2 fronts, as Britain was still fighting, Hitler felt destiny calling him to eradicate the Bolshevik poison, as he called it, and could not resist. He would, he said, kick open the door, and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. On the 22nd of June 1941, Wehrmacht troops swept over the border. The German people were informed at 5:30 in the morning. Hitler had the ideological war he wanted. He would crush communism at the same time as he would gain vital space in which the new Germans could live. Russia would collapse as rapidly as the West had done, and Moscow would be his within 3 months. Then Leningrad and Moscow would be obliterated. This was what he had planned. This is what seemed to be happening in the campaign by the master race against an inferior breed, as Hitler described them. In Russia, Hitler could have his anti-Semitic and anti-communist racist orders carried out on a vast scale and in the shortest possible time. The Russians, like the Poles before them, were to be pushed from their land, made slaves or murdered. Scarcely had the Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union than squads of SS and Gestapo came in behind them, each army group with its own special action Einsatzgruppe of the SS, responsible only to Heinrich Himmler. Hitler was certainly a man true to his word. However, the enormity of the vision overwhelmed him and propelled him into a war which he was not mentally capable of conducting unless there was no or inadequate resistance. Churchill knew no more about Russia and its ability to defend itself than Hitler did. The purges in the armed forces by Stalin had in fact severely weakened the Red Army, to the point where no officer dared to issue an order for fear that it would be seen as wrong, with lethal consequences for the officer. Hitler visited Russia soon after the invasion. This was, after all, the war that he had envisaged since he had first entered the National Socialist arena. Russia was his personal war, Hitler against Stalin, the loathed communism against fascism. He was in control of all other conflicts, Britain and North Africa. These he would sideline by this spectacular display of unbridled power. He would save the world from the degeneracy into which it had fallen, and Russia was to be the jewel in his crown. Heinz Guderian was an outspoken, impetuous general whose unbridled temperament led to his managing to aggravate every single senior commander who had anything to do with him. He had been one of the men to grasp the significance of swift armoured thrusts on the battlefield, and used the principle to devastating effect in France in 1940. He was not taken in, as Hitler was, by the enormous number of prisoners in the early weeks of Barbarossa. The capture of objectives was more important to him, and Moscow was a vital objective, perhaps the most vital objective, not Kiev in the south. He voiced his opinions, and Hitler furiously turned on him, beginning a feud that led to Guderian's dismissal in December 1941. Hitler was greedy for territory and ignored Guderian. Whereas the other generals wanted to capture towns, especially Moscow, to add to their own prestige and vied with each other for the honor, the Führer wanted to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. Moscow was not his first priority. Deceived by the ease of the invasion, Hitler made a grave mistake. Guderian, along with the greater part of the 2nd Panzer Group, was detached from Army Group Center to go and assist Army Group South and the panzers commanded by von Kleist in the battle for Kiev. The success at Kiev seemed to prove the strength of Hitler's military strategy. A staggering 750,000 Red Army soldiers were captured. The fact that out of every 100 men, just 3 would be alive at the end of the war vividly points out the brutality of German captivity. Starvation and execution awaited Russian prisoners of war, the subhumans. 3 million Soviets had been lost after just 12 weeks of fighting. In July, Army Group South joined in the success of the other groups when they encircled 100,000 Soviets. Then, helped by the 2nd Panzer Group, which Hitler had extracted from Army Group Center, they followed this with another 650,000 prisoners outside Kiev. These Russian captives would be amongst the first to feel the barbarity of the invaders. If any fell ill or even fell over, they were shot where they lay. Those Red Army soldiers from the Central Asian Republic suffered the most under the brutality of their captors. In a cynical and vain attempt to try and stifle the rumors of atrocities, the Germans in Kiev released some of their prisoners of war. On July the 16th, as a result of the seemingly astonishing success of Barbarossa, Hitler was eagerly telling Field Marshal Keitel and others in the Nazi leadership of his plans to starve to death the urban Russian population and captured Red Army soldiers. As there had been little protest against the execution of Jews in the first days of the invasion, the program would be expanded so that not only the Jewish population, but also anyone who objected to the plans of the new regime would face the executioners. Resettlement of Germans into the new territories would not be long in coming. None of this was known to the Wehrmacht soldiers or the Ukrainians who welcomed them as liberators. Hitler felt his invincibility grow. It was a heady moment for the Third Reich and a period of intense anxiety for the rest of the world. Stalin was reaping the disaster he himself had caused. Through his pact with Germany, He had isolated Russia and enabled the Wehrmacht to sweep through the rest of Europe. He had decimated the number of officers in the Red Army in his previous purges. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, probably the most outstanding of his commanders, had been replaced when he had warned that the Germans were pushing to encircle Ukrainian armies. Now Stalin needed extreme terror, helped by the atrocities of Nazi annihilation tactics, to keep his men fighting. With heavy losses for the Russians, the fighting surged onwards in the south and culminated in the fall of the city of Rostov at the mouth of the Don River on November the 21st. To Hitler, the maps told of glorious success. As he proudly showed Mussolini the results of his warped ideologies in the Ukraine, he should have taken time to talk to his troops. Had he ever listened, the fighting troops could have told him a very different story. Hitler had originally blunted the attack in the north by using the 16th Army to assist Army Group Center in Operation Typhoon, the attack on Moscow. There were no substantial reinforcements to make up for losses. Now Hitler reversed his earlier decision, and units from Army Group Center were sent north to help in the push to Leningrad. This seesaw effect only served to weaken each of the thrusts at vital points in their advances. Still, Hitler's optimism appeared justified as the Wehrmacht advanced on all fronts. Leningrad he ordered to be besieged, as he did not wish to lose men in street fighting. Despite the autumn mud, the Wehrmacht fought its way to within 40 miles of Moscow. On October the 3rd, 1941, Hitler declared that the enemy in the east had been struck down, never to rise again. By November, after 5 months of fighting, Hitler had lost nearly 1/4 of his army. General Edward Wagner, Quartermaster General, reported that the Wehrmacht was at the end of its resources and about to be confronted with the dangers of deep winter. As in the centre and southern sections, it was obvious that the German army in the north, despite their spectacular advances, had not achieved any of their objectives. Leningrad was a city in agony. Oil and coal supplies had been exhausted by the end of September, and without warmth as winter set in, the water pipes froze and burst. Drinking water was almost non-existent. Those who died could not be buried in the frozen ground. Rations were reduced to 1/3 of the total required by a normal adult, and cats, dogs and birds were killed to provide food for the slowly starving population. Even rats were caught and eaten, and stories of cannibalism were not unknown. As November passed into December, the number of deaths rose dramatically. 11,000 died in November. In December, it was 53,000. When the Soviets launched a counter-offensive at Army Group Center in December, Höppner, commanding the 4th Panzer Group, fell victim to Hitler's overblown self-belief in his own abilities, as did General Brauchitsch, whose command Hitler took over, accusing him of being a vain, cowardly wretch and nincompoop. 35 generals fell under Hitler's axe, one sentenced to death for withdrawing. Franz Halder became commander-in-chief. Hitler's message was clear to all those who did not stand fast as he ordered. From now on, Hitler, always suspicious of his generals, dominated the Wehrmacht. In the south, any plans to hold their positions for the winter in their weakened state were shattered. A Red Army counterattack struck the Germans, the first of many heavy blows that rolled them back, and von Rundstedt asked for permission to withdraw his troops. Hitler's refusal was irrelevant, as the Germans were soon forced to evacuate Rostov when the Russians hurled troops at the astonished Wehrmacht soldiers. It was the first vicious warning that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, and fatally was ignored by Hitler. Von Rundstedt now asked for permission to set up a front line for the winter some 80 miles behind Rostov. Hitler removed him from his command, replacing him with von Bock. The retreat had to be carried out anyway to 40 miles west of Rostov, the first of many retreats in the south. Von Bock mistakenly thought that Army Group South was now safe until the next year. The limit of the advance for 1941 had been reached. Exhausted and overstretched, the Wehrmacht could go no further. But the Führer's arrogance and contempt for the Russian people made him ignore the dangers. Hitler, who thought himself to be a supreme strategist and commander, had left his men without winter uniforms. The front line stalled. Hitler's infallibility was shown for what it was, a worthless facade. The soldiers began to realize that their lives meant nothing to the Führer. That truth was to be made even more brutally clear as Hitler pursued his fantasies no matter how many lives were lost. Hitler's Moscow dream was shattered on the 5th of December. The Red Army counterattacked under Zhukov's command. The onslaught smashed into the German lines, and there was no option but to retreat. The fighting was remorseless, and without sufficient transport, artillery guns and equipment had to be left behind. Faced with the prospect of a retreat that would equal Napoleon's disastrous withdrawal, Hitler took command on the 19th of December following the resignation of Commander-in-Chief, General von Brauchitsch. He issued the order that the retreat should be halted. Von Kluge became the new Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Center, but could not save the situation. The Red Army battered against the German lines and steadily pushed the Wehrmacht back. It was thanks to Stalin's over-ambitious attempt to roll back the entire Russian front that Army Group Center survived into January. The men now realized that they would not win. 300,000 Germans were killed or captured in the first month of the Russian counterattack. The dread of captivity kept the soldiers fighting hard, as they knew that prisoners were hardly ever taken by the Russians, and those that were captured were treated appallingly. The situation was desperate. The men of Army Group North besieging Leningrad had to endure the worst of the Russian winters, which were far more ferocious in their sector than elsewhere. Hitler refused to believe the worst, refused to believe that his plans had failed, and his whole concept for Lebensraum, indeed his entire Reich, was crumbling. In December, Hitler made another catastrophic decision born of his distorted sense of invincibility, which persisted despite frequent signs of his instability and problematic decision-making. A German-Japanese pact had been signed in 1936, and then revived and celebrated on November the 25th, 1941. On the 14th of December, Japan attacked and bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In an act of arrogant foolishness, Hitler declared war on the United States. Hitler's hatred for the Jews had led to the concentration camps being built as far back as 1933. Since then, they had been erected all over Poland and Germany. In Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, Dachau and Buchenwald, the manifestation of Hitler's distorted thinking, his contempt for human life, could be seen for the unbridled evil that it was. The inhumanity defied description. Even Nazis were silenced when confronted with the vile reality. In Russia, as the victorious Wehrmacht conquered more and more land, the Gestapo and SS, as Hitler's executioners, shot and mistreated countless numbers of soldiers and civilians. Army Group South had now crossed the Don River, and by the middle of August had reached Krasnodar, getting as far as the first oil fields near Maikop in November. The oil fields at Baku and Grozny were just a few hundred miles away. The panzers would never reach them. Not having learned the lessons of the year before, blinded by arrogance and ignorance, Hitler allowed the German lines to become overstretched once more. Each assault was carried out with smaller and smaller units. The result was inevitable. A 2,000-mile advance was about to collapse. Although the Red Army was fighting for survival, the Germans had reached the limits of their ability to wage war. From September 1942, Russian plans were drawn up for an offensive against the troops attacking Stalingrad, which was ripe for a pincer movement that would entrap the Germans fighting there. The design for the attack was largely Zhukov's. Aware of the dangers, Chief of Staff Zeitzler flew to meet Hitler and ask for a withdrawal even before he knew of the Russian offensive, prophesying a disaster unless something was urgently undertaken. Hitler scathingly refused. As far as he was concerned, this was just another local difficulty that would be overcome. He thought the Russians had no reserves left. The die was cast. In October, the Germans made another attempt on the city, advancing towards the Volga. Artillery pounded the town and the Luftwaffe bombed without cease. Still, the numbers of Russians did not decrease. Stalingrad disintegrated into rubble under smoke and flames. The Russian reinforcements soon reached 750,000 troops. On November the 10th, von Paulus asked Hitler for permission to withdraw. It was refused. On November the 19th, the Russian counterattack began. A thunderous artillery bombardment was followed by the infantry charging in. The vicious fire and fighting resulted in the German lines being penetrated just hours after the attack had begun. By the end of 1942, Hitler was faced with the collapse of everything that he lived for. as Rommel was being pushed back in North Africa and the Wehrmacht was pushed back in Russia. The first bomber stream with 1,000 bombers had appeared in the skies over Germany. The U-boats were still unable to cut the Atlantic lifeline to Britain. Hitler felt that a curse had been put on him, but his worst fears were about to be overwhelmed by what was the turning point of the war, Stalingrad. After months of the most brutal fighting even this brutal war had produced, Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus, against Hitler's wishes, surrendered on the 2nd of February 1943. The once mighty 6th Army was lost. Of 250,000 men in the Stalingrad pocket, 90,000 went into captivity. Hitler had urged them to fight like heroes. His next worry was how to eradicate the shame of defeat. Paulus had been made a field marshal and expected to commit suicide for the glory of the Reich. No other German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus had defied the Führer, and Hitler was powerless to change the situation or exact revenge. After Stalingrad, Hitler saw his dream crumble almost day by day as the losses amongst the Wehrmacht increased and the Russians began to offer more effective resistance. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was losing the battle against Montgomery. The Americans, through Operation Torch, were also in North Africa, and the Allies had landed in Sicily and pushed their way on up through the Italian mainland. Everyone but Hitler could see that the war was being lost despite the extraordinary fighting ability of the Wehrmacht soldiers. The year had shaken Hitler's picture of himself. Gone was the strutting warlord. His whole character had rapidly begun to decline. He was not often seen in public, but his face and eyes betrayed his inner turmoil when he did. The few occasions he left his retreat were to attend the funerals of Germany's fallen heroes. Death, he said, was just a brief moment, and then came freedom from everything. When at his headquarters, he was withdrawn, more often alone. He seemed bitter, and the drugs he took were affecting his ability to think clearly. When in company, he unleashed on his listeners long lectures on dog training and the evil in the world. Henning von Treschow decided that the time had come to end Hitler's rule. A British-made bomb, disguised as a Cointreau bottle, was taken onto Hitler's plane as he left for Smolensk in Russia to visit the front on March the 13th, 1943. The bomb failed to go off. Hitler also escaped another attempt 1 week later by a friend of Treschow's, whose pockets were filled with bombs that could not be detonated when Hitler left early. Hitler had decided to retire to Linz in Austria, where building work on his residence continued throughout the war. His burial place would be in the bell tower of a huge complex, which would include a museum. Throughout the winter and late spring of 1944, the Russians moved further and further west. In May, 80,000 German prisoners were taken from the Crimea. Hitler aggravated the already insurmountable problems with his senseless orders to stand fast, ignoring the mobile defense suggested by his generals. Such orders effectively led to death sentences for his forces each time he issued them. Even as the Allied invasion force of 155,000 men was crossing the Channel in June 1944, no one could be certain that the iron grip the Nazi regime held over the Wehrmacht, coupled with the fighting spirit of the German soldiers, could be overcome. Eisenhower, in charge of European operations, had prepared two speeches, one to announce success and one to admit to failure. Believing that an attack would come from Dover and strike in the Pas-de-Calais, the Germans were caught off guard, and the sea was rough when Eisenhower gave the green light. Rommel was in charge of the defences in the west, but had gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday. Once the Allies had gained a foothold and begun to fight their way inland in northern France, Hitler no longer stood any chance of keeping the war away from Germany. His clouded mind could not accept the reality that his staff officers were describing to him, and he obstinately refused to believe them. Failure was not acceptable. His generals became increasingly alarmed at the irrational decisions he would make, changing his mind and then unsure as to whether he had made the right decision. On June the 22nd, 1944, Operation Bagration, a gigantic Russian offensive, broke over the entire Eastern Front and led to the disintegration of Army Group Center in just 2 weeks. Neither Hitler's order to stand firm nor the appointment of General Model as commander of Army Group Center could change the inevitability of the situation. Both men seemed to have lost contact with the rapidly changing events in the field. On June the 23rd, a lightning Russian offensive was underway and had soon surrounded Army Group Center. Suffering 450,000 casualties, the group was effectively wiped out. With the front line torn apart, the two remaining army groups had to retreat as fast as they could in order to prevent capture or destruction. Hitler, the corporal, had never been a favorite of the Prussian military elite, although most had followed him in his loathing of the Versailles Treaty. They had planned overthrow attempts since 1938, but Hitler's success and continued British hesitation made them delay their plans. Now, with German towns being decimated, they wanted to avert a Russian invasion and put in place a government with which the Western powers would be prepared to negotiate a peace settlement. They decided that they had to act again to kill Hitler. And the Gestapo was working its way closer to the conspirators. Time was short. General Friedrich Olbricht, of German High Command, recruited Colonel Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg to carry out the assassination. He had been made Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Fromm, also part of the conspiracy, which gave Stauffenberg the opportunity to attend the military conferences with Hitler. On the 11th of July, he hid a bomb with a timer in his briefcase and flew to meet Hitler at his headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. He decided to abort the attempt when he found that Himmler, who was to be killed at the same time, as was Hermann Göring, was not present. On the 15th he was again at Rastenburg, and was forced a second time to abort the mission when Hitler left the room. On July the 20th, 1944, at 12:30, another Führer conference began, and this time von Stauffenberg primed the bomb. He left the room shortly before the explosion at 12:40. Hitler's trousers were blown off, but the bomb had been moved by Heinz Brandt before it exploded and placed beside a heavy table leg. Hitler survived. His luck was still a factor in his grip on power. 3 officers and a secretary were badly injured and died later, as did Brandt, who lost his leg in the blast. The arrests of the conspirators and many thousands of others began immediately. Hitler visited the military hospital where those who had been injured were treated. His escape made him believe the war would be won after all. It was, he said, a divine moment in history. He demanded that all the conspirators be hanged like cattle. Many took their own lives. Others were hanged. Fromm had executed Stauffenberg and Olbricht on the night of the 20th in the courtyard of the Bendler Block building, where the conspiracy had been planned. It was an attempt to deflect suspicion from himself, but Fromm was arrested a day later and sentenced to death for inaction. Hitler had wanted the conspirators alive. Hitler personally agreed that Fromm could be shot, as it was more honorable. General Guderian was made Army Chief of Staff following the assassination attempt. In his elevated position, he could vent his anger at those such as von Kluge, who had barricaded his way in the past, or push National Socialist ideology more vehemently onto his officers, but he was unable to change the outcome on the Eastern Front. The Russians surged forward as unstoppable as once the Germans had been. Before long, they were on the borders of Eastern Prussia, on the way to Berlin. Erwin Rommel, Hitler's favorite general, was implicated in the plot to kill Hitler. Rommel had first been approached in early 1944, and in February agreed to support the conspiracy in order, as he said, to come to the rescue of Germany. But he wanted Hitler arrested and put on trial, not assassinated. Hitler had ordered Rommel to deport all Jews in France. Rommel disobeyed the order and even wrote letters of protest at the treatment Jews were receiving. Perhaps his status as one of Hitler's favorite generals helped him. He also disobeyed Hitler's commando order of 1942, whereby all Allied commandos were to be immediately executed. In future, Hitler wrote, all terror and sabotage troops of the British and their accomplices, who do not act like soldiers but rather like bandits, will be treated as such by the German troops and will be ruthlessly eliminated in battle wherever they appear. Rommel was implicated by Caesar von Hofacker under Gestapo torture, and also by other conspirators, and Hitler, afraid of the consequences of such a high-ranking and popular officer being tried, gave him a choice. The People's Court and almost certain conviction and death, or suicide and his family spared. Rommel said goodbye to his family and took cyanide. Hitler, in keeping with his fear of being discovered to be the creature that he was, made sure that a burial with Nazi pomp was given to the Field Marshal. Rommel had not wanted any of the Nazi paraphernalia on his coffin, but Hitler was not about to let a chance for Nazi glorification of death to pass unnoticed. He ordered a day of mourning and sent Field Marshal von Rundstedt as his representative to the funeral. And now, as the Allies advanced onto the French capital, he ordered that Paris be left in rubble after the German retreat. The city, he demanded, must not fall into the enemy's hand except lying in complete debris. The order was ignored by the military governor, General Dietrich von Choltitz. In August 1944, the Free French were allowed to enter a city hardly touched by war. On the 20th of September 1944, Hitler, who no longer had control of himself, let alone his armies, gave command of the remnant of Army Group South in Russia to General Freisner. An academic move, for the end result, despite the bitter resistance of the Wehrmacht soldiers now fighting to avoid the destruction of their homeland, was as sure as it could be. In a last desperate attempt to salvage his Nazi Reich, Hitler ordered his last full-scale offensive against the Allies. For anyone aware of the situation on the ground, the attack was destined to be a waste of German lives for no gain. It was to take place in the Ardennes, where the great German breakthrough had taken place in 1940. It began on the 16th of December 1944. Hitler had left Berlin for his headquarters in southern Germany. He thought that if the western border was protected, he could then also protect his eastern border and have time to develop more sophisticated weapons, and that the British and Americans would ask for peace terms independent of the Soviets. The conflict became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Americans were unprepared for the attack, despite warnings that an offensive was imminent, and it took the Allies until the 25th of January 1945 to stabilize and halt the attack. By that time, Hitler's SS had committed 2 massacres of US soldiers. Now even Hitler realized that his luck had run out. His famous risk-taking no longer brought results, and on January the 7th, 1945, with the Wehrmacht abandoning their armour through lack of fuel, he ordered all forces in the Ardennes to withdraw. By April 1945, the Russians were outside Berlin and the Allies on German soil in the west. Hitler was running the war from his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, and his advisors urged him to leave. But as the war closed down on the capital, he was only a shadow of the man who had come to power. His left hand trembled, and he was lost in fantasies as he urged his generals to move non-existent armies to the front to win a victory that was impossible to attain. Hitler had ordered a scorched earth policy, filled with scorn and contempt for a German nation that he said had forfeited its right to survive. Arms Minister Albert Speer was given the task of implementing this policy. He disobeyed the Führer. The Russians launched their final offensive against Berlin on April the 16th, 1945. As Russian shells reached the center of Berlin on April the 20th, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday. Hitler refused to give up. There was nothing left for him to lose. He seldom left the bunker except as here to encourage the young boys of the Hitler Youth to fight on. The state of his mind was only too plain. "If we can't win," he said, "we shall drag half the world into the abyss." In Berlin, the SS kept the old men and teenagers fighting against the overwhelming might of the Russians, as once beautiful Berlin was blown to rubble. When Hitler was told it had not been possible to launch an offensive that he had ordered to be carried out by Waffen-SS General Steiner to attack the flanks of the First Belarusian Front, he flew into a rage at the incompetence and treachery of his commanders. In an attempt to save the situation, Himmler tried to agree a surrender directly with the Allies, sending Hitler into a rage, whilst Göring in Berchtesgaden suggested that as deputy and successor to the Führer, he should take over the running of the country as Hitler was isolated in Berlin. Martin Bormann denounced the treachery of the two men, mindful of his own ambitions. Furious, Hitler called them traitors, sacked them, expelled them from the Nazi Party, and had Göring arrested. Eva Braun was with Hitler in the bunker in these last weeks. They had known each other since 1929, and she had been a member of the household in his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden in the Alps from 1936. Fearful of losing the support of his female admirers, Eva's relationship with him had remained a secret to the world. Against Hitler's orders, she travelled to the bunker in Berlin in early April. His appearance shocked her. He was no longer the arrogant dictator who had strutted in Czechoslovakia and conquered Paris. He was bowed and had aged. But she refused to leave him in the last hours as the Russians closed in on the bunker. She was, as he rightly said, one of the few people that had remained loyal. Now, on the 29th of April 1945, when the dreams and fantasies were crushed in the rubble of the German capital, Hitler knew the cruel game he had been playing was over. He married his longtime companion. "I feel myself betrayed and deceived by those in whom I placed my trust," wrote Hitler. On April the 29th, Hitler dictated his will to Martin Bormann, and, in an act that indicated how close the two men had become, and how divorced from reality Hitler was, named him as next leader of the Nazi Party. Hitler's brinkmanship had taken Germany and its people over the edge and into the depths. Now he had only one wish. The nation had proved itself unworthy of the task he had set for it. The country and the people were therefore worthless to him. His only desire was that Germany and the remaining Jews should be destroyed with him. Germany was to be totally obliterated, so that not one house was left standing for the Allies to conquer. His generals, finally and too late, disobeyed the Führer. For the first time anyone could recall, Hitler kissed Eva on the mouth just before they went to his rooms. On the 30th of April 1945, Eva Braun, 33 years old, bit on a cyanide capsule. It is probable that Hitler then shot her in the head. Historians assume that he too took cyanide and then shot himself in the temple. The bodies were taken outside and burned in the Reich Chancellery garden. The Russians found the bodies when they arrived, together with the corpse of Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda and their 6 children, themselves the victims of Hitler's contempt for human life. They had been poisoned by their parents. Hitler showed no understanding that he had ever been wrong. In his eyes, defeat was due to betrayal by the officers of the Wehrmacht. For him, the Jewish race was, at the end as at the beginning, responsible for all that was wrong with the world. The war ended in Europe, and Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, with its concentration camps and dreams of a master race, ended with it. In the East, the Japanese were still fighting for victory for their own version of the master race, until Harry S. Truman, the new American president, ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. The nightmare shadow of a world ruled by an unstable megalomaniac had passed. Hitler's cohorts, the men he had been close to and who had shared his vision of the future, were tried at Nuremberg, and many were executed. Martin Bormann's remains were found many years later in the earth in Berlin. Himmler committed suicide, as did Göring. During his trial, he had said to the psychiatrist Leon Goldensohn, "To me there are 2 Hitlers. one who existed until the end of the war in France, the other begins with the campaign in Russia. In the beginning he was genial and pleasant. He would have extraordinary willpower and unheard of influence on people. The important thing to remember is that the first Hitler, the man who I knew until the end of the French war, had much charm and goodwill. He was always frank. The second Hitler, who existed from the beginning of the Russian campaign until his suicide, was always suspicious, easily upset and tense, distrustful to an extreme degree. Hitler had the willpower of a demon. If he hadn't, he would never have achieved anything. Adolf Hitler had caused the agonizing death and injury of untold millions, the wholesale destruction of European cities and countries, with once beautiful German cities such as Berlin, Hamburg and Dresden left blackened ruins. Finally, unwilling to account for the evil of his actions, he escaped into death, leaving behind a scarred and traumatized world.